Hello, everyone. Welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight, we bring you 8 deeply unsettling accounts from the forgotten hollows and isolated communities scattered throughout Appalachia. These mountain towns, many barely clinging to the map, harbor secrets that outsiders were never meant to discover. The stories you're about to hear come from people who ventured into these close-knit communities and found something waiting in the mist-shrouded valleys. Something that doesn't take kindly to strangers asking questions. From century-old traditions that should have stayed buried to things that move through the laurel thickets after sunset, these testimonies remind us that some small towns stay small for a reason. If you make it to the end, consider subscribing to Blacktop Files, because we're only beginning to scratch the surface of what hides in America's oldest mountains.
This happened in the fall of 2017 when I was 29 years old. My name's Sarah, and I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio. I'd taken a position as a traveling nurse, which meant short-term contracts in rural hospitals that were desperately understaffed. The pay was good, and I liked the idea of seeing different parts of the country. That September, I accepted a 3-month contract at a small hospital in eastern Kentucky in a town I'll call Harlan Springs. The recruiter warned me it was remote, but I figured I'd handled rural placements before. I drove down on a gray Sunday afternoon, winding through increasingly narrow roads that carved between steep, forested ridges. The GPS kept losing signal, and more than once I had to backtrack when the pavement suddenly ended at a creek ford or a washed-out bridge. Harlan Springs, when I finally found it, was a collection of maybe 200 buildings wedged into a valley so narrow the sun probably only hit Main Street for a few hours each day. The hospital sat at the far end of town, a squat brick building from the 1960s with a faded emergency sign. My apartment was a furnished studio above the town's only pharmacy, which also served as the post office and the place where locals picked up their propane tanks. The landlord, an elderly man named Chester, met me with the keys and a strange warning. "Don't go walking the old railroad bed after dark," he said, not looking at me directly. "And if someone invites you to a church service, you make sure it's the Baptist one on Main Street. There's another church up Cutter's Hollow, and folks from town don't go there." I thanked him, assuming he was just protective of an outsider, maybe worried I'd wander into private property or something. The hospital work was what I expected. Understaffed emergency room, a lot of black lung cases, opioid overdoses, injuries from the coal mines that were still barely operational. The staff were polite but distant. I tried making conversation during breaks, but I kept hitting walls. When I mentioned I'd driven past an abandoned railroad trestle and thought it looked like a good place to take photos, the other nurses exchanged glances. "That's the old coal line," one of them finally said. "Nobody uses that path anymore. Just stay off it." I let it go, but the warnings nagged at me. I'm not someone who spooks easily, and I'd worked in plenty of isolated places. On my second week there, during a rare afternoon off, I decided to explore the town on foot. Harlan Springs had that Appalachian poverty you see in documentaries: houses with sagging porches, tarps over broken windows, yards full of rusted equipment, and hound dogs chained to trees. But there was something else too. Every other house had these weird arrangements on the porch: jars filled with nails and rusty water, bundles of dried herbs hanging above the doors, lines of salt across the thresholds. At first I thought it was just local tradition, maybe folk medicine or decoration, but the repetition of it felt deliberate, almost offensive. I walked to the end of Main Street, where a gravel road split off and climbed up into the hills. A hand-painted sign read, "Cutter's Hollow, 2 miles." This had to be the area Chester warned me about, with the church locals avoided. My curiosity got the better of me. I started up the road, telling myself I'd just go a little way, see what the fuss was about. The trees closed in quickly, mostly oak and poplar, with thick undergrowth of rhododendron. The temperature dropped noticeably in the shade, and the only sounds were my footsteps on gravel and the occasional bird call. About a mile up, I came around a bend and saw the church. It was a small white clapboard building, very old, with a steeply pitched roof and narrow windows. The paint was peeling. and the churchyard was overgrown, but it didn't look abandoned. There were fresh tire tracks in the mud, and I could see the front door was slightly ajar. What struck me most were the trees surrounding it. Every single one had strips of cloth tied to the branches, hundreds of them, in various states of decay. Some were bright and new, others had rotted to mere threads. The effect was unsettling, like the forest itself was wrapped in bandages. I should have turned back. Instead, I walked closer. Through the open door, I could see the interior was lit by candles, dozens of them, even though it was mid-afternoon. I heard singing, very faint, voices blending in a harmony that didn't sound quite right. The melody was unfamiliar, words I couldn't make out, but that sent a shiver down my spine. I stopped at the bottom of the steps leading up to the door, suddenly very aware that I was trespassing, that I was exactly where I'd been told not to go. The singing stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard footsteps inside the church, coming toward the door. I backed away quickly, turned, and walked as fast as I could without running back down the gravel road. I didn't look behind me, but I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched, not just from the church, but from the woods on either side of the road. When I finally made it back to Main Street, I was breathing hard, and I noticed two older men sitting outside the pharmacy, watching me. One of them shook his head slowly, like I'd done something disappointing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those cloth strips, the candles in the middle of the day, the wrongness of that singing. Around 2 a.m, I heard something outside my window. A rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on glass. My apartment was on the second floor. I got up and looked out, but saw nothing except the empty street below, lit by a single street lamp. The tapping continued, coming from different parts of the window, moving around the frame. I closed the curtains and sat on my bed until it stopped about 20 minutes later. The next day at work, I was exhausted. During lunch, I mentioned to one of the older nurses, a woman named Dottie who'd been at the hospital for 30 years, that I'd walked up to Cutter's Hollow. Her face went pale. "You went inside the church?" she asked urgently. I shook my head and explained I'd only stood outside for a moment. She relaxed slightly but still looked worried. "That church has been there since before the town," she said quietly. "It's not Christian, not really. The people who go there, they practice something older. They keep to themselves, and we keep away from them. There's an understanding. But if they think you're interested, if they think you're looking for something," she trailed off, then added, "just stay away from there, and don't go out alone after dark for a while." I wanted to laugh it off, to think this was just mountain superstition, but something in her tone stopped me. Over the next week, I started noticing things. When I left the hospital after evening shifts, I'd see the same truck parked across the street. An old Chevy with 2 people sitting inside, faces obscured. It would pull away when I looked directly at it. I found small objects left on the doorstep of my apartment. A crow's feather tied with black thread, a smooth stone with a hole worn through it, a tiny cloth bag that smelled of earth and something sour. I threw them away, but new ones appeared. Then the dream started. I'd dream I was back on that gravel road, walking up to the church, but this time the door was wide open, and the interior was much larger than it should be, stretching back impossibly far. The congregation was there, maybe 40 people, all standing and facing me. Their mouths were open in song, but no sound came out, and their eyes were completely black, reflecting the candlelight like animals' eyes caught in headlights. I'd wake up gasping, and sometimes in those first moments of waking, I'd still hear the faint echo of that wrong harmony. 3 weeks after my visit to Cutter's Hollow, I had a day shift and left the hospital around 5 p.m. It was getting dark earlier by then, the mountains cutting off the sun prematurely. As I walked back toward my apartment, a woman stepped out from an alley between 2 buildings. She was maybe 60, wearing a long skirt and a cardigan despite the mild weather, her gray hair pulled back severely. "You came to our church," she said. It wasn't a question. I stopped, my heart pounding. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just curious." She studied me for a long moment. "Curiosity is a door," she said. "You opened it. Now something's taken notice." I didn't know what to say to that. She continued, "You're not from here. You don't understand how things work in these hills. There are old agreements, old ways. We worship as we always have, and in return we're protected. But protection requires feeding. It requires attention." I felt my skin crawl. "What does that mean?" I asked. She smiled, and it was not comforting. It means you should finish your contract and leave. Don't come back to Harlan Springs. Don't talk about what you've seen. And tonight, put salt on your windowsills and don't answer if you hear knocking. She walked away before I could respond, disappearing around a corner. I stood there in the growing darkness, suddenly very aware of how isolated I was, how far from anyone who knew me. I went to the pharmacy before it closed and bought every container of salt Chester had. That night, I lined my windows and door frame with it, feeling ridiculous but too scared not to. Around midnight, the knocking started again, but this time it was on my door, not the window. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Then a woman's voice, called my name. "Sarah, we'd like to talk to you. We'd like to show you something." I sat frozen on my bed, my phone in my hand. Though I knew calling 911 would be pointless. What would I even say? The knocking continued for hours, sometimes at the door, sometimes at the windows, sometimes seeming to come from the walls themselves. Different voices called to me, men and women, sometimes children. They said they just wanted to talk, that they had something to give me, that I'd been chosen for something special. By dawn, it stopped. I didn't go to work that day. I called in sick and started packing. I'd decided I was done with the contract, done with Harlan Springs. I'd lose the money, maybe damage my reputation with the agency, but I didn't care. As I was loading my car that afternoon, Chester came up the external stairs. "You're leaving," he said, looking almost relieved. "That's smart, you stirred something up, and it won't let go easy. Get in your car and drive straight through until you're out of the county. Don't stop for anyone. And if you see anyone walking along the road, trying to flag you down, especially at dusk or after dark, do not stop. Just keep driving." I took his advice, I threw my bags in the car, and left immediately, not even stopping, to officially resign. As I drove out of town, heading for the highway, I passed the gravel road that led to Cutter's Hollow. Standing at the junction were 5 or 6 people, just standing there, watching my car pass. I recognized the woman who'd spoken to me the day before. They didn't wave or gesture, just watched with expressions I couldn't read. I pressed the accelerator and didn't look in the rear view mirror. The drive out was nerve-wracking. Twice I saw figures standing by the roadside, thumb out as if hitchhiking, but something about them made me grip the wheel tighter and keep my speed up. One of them, an old man in overalls, turned to watch me pass, and I swear his eyes reflected my headlights, glowing amber in the twilight. I didn't stop for gas until I was 2 counties over, at a busy truck stop on the interstate, around 9 o'clock at night. My hands were shaking as I filled the tank. I never went back to Appalachia for work. I broke my contract, paid the penalty, and took assignments exclusively in the Midwest and out west after that. The nursing agency blacklisted me for a year, but it was worth it. I still have the dreams sometimes, less frequently now, but more vivid when they come. In them, I'm always walking up that gravel road and the church door is always open. And I know that this time I won't be able to stop myself from going inside, from joining that congregation in whatever they're really worshiping. I wake up before I reach the threshold, but each time I get a little closer. I've never told anyone this story in full before, but I saw Blacktop Files and thought maybe someone should know. If you're ever offered work in that part of Kentucky, in a little town pressed up in a narrow valley with a church up in Cutter's Hollow, turn it down. Some places aren't meant for outsiders, and some invitations aren't really invitations at all.
Our next story comes from someone who discovered that not every historical site in Appalachia should be disturbed, especially when the locals have spent generations making sure it stays forgotten.
My name's Marcus, and I'm 34 now. Back in 2015, I was getting my master's in folklore and anthropology at the University of North Carolina. I'm from Charlotte originally, definitely a city kid, but I'd always been fascinated by Appalachian culture, especially the old stories and ballads that got passed down through generations. For my thesis, I wanted to do field research on a specific topic: abandoned communities. There are dozens of them throughout the mountains, places that were thriving 100 years ago, but got depopulated by the decline of coal, timber companies pulling out, or the creation of national parks, forcing people off their land. I found a reference in an old county history to a settlement called Redbone, located in a remote part of southwestern Virginia. According to the text, Redbone had been established in the 1820s and abandoned completely by 1935, though the reason wasn't specified. What caught my attention was a footnote that mentioned unusual folk practices and a community that kept itself separate even from other mountain settlements. That was exactly the kind of thing I was looking for. I planned a trip for late October, figuring I'd spend a week camping in the area, locating the old settlement, taking photographs, maybe finding some artifacts or structures that could tell me what life had been like there. I drove down from Chapel Hill, my RAV4 packed with camping gear, recording equipment, and survey maps I'd ordered from the USGS. The nearest town to Redbone's supposed location was a place called Varney, population maybe 400, clinging to the side of a mountain with a single gas station, a post office, and a combination dollar store and diner. I stopped there to fill up and ask directions. The woman behind the counter, maybe 50, with tired eyes and a cigarette burning in an ashtray beside the register, looked at me suspiciously when I mentioned Redbone. "Why you want to know about that?" she asked. I explained my research, showed her my university ID to prove I wasn't just some treasure hunter or vandal. She shook her head slowly. "Redbone's been gone a long time. Nothing up there but old foundations and bad memories. People from Varney don't go up that way." I asked why, and she just repeated, "We don't go up there," and refused to say more. An old man sitting at the diner counter turned around and added, "Son, you take my advice. You'll find another ghost town to study. Redbone was abandoned for a reason, and that reason didn't leave when the people did." I thanked them for the concern, but I'd driven 5 hours, and I wasn't turning back because of vague warnings. Following my maps, I took a Forest Service road that climbed into increasingly rough terrain. After about 8 miles, the maintained road ended and became a rutted track barely wide enough for one vehicle. I pushed on for another 3 miles until the track became impassable, blocked by a fallen tree that looked like it had been there for years. I parked, shouldered my pack, and continued on foot. The forest was dense here, second growth mostly, with occasional massive chestnuts that had survived the blight, their trunks 6 feet in diameter. The understory was thick with mountain laurel and brush, making it hard to see more than 30 feet in any direction. I hiked for about 2 hours, using my GPS and the old maps to navigate. The October afternoon was overcast, the light flat and gray, making everything look washed out. Finally, I started seeing signs of the old settlement, a stone chimney standing alone, the rectangular depression where a cabin had been, rusted pieces of farm equipment nearly consumed by vegetation. I felt a thrill of discovery. This was it, Redbone. I set up my camp in a small clearing near a creek, far enough from the ruins that I felt like I wasn't being disrespectful, and spent the remaining daylight exploring and taking photographs. The settlement had been larger than I expected, maybe 20 or 30 structures originally. Most were completely gone, but several stone foundations remained, along with 5 chimneys still standing. What struck me as odd was the layout. The cabins weren't scattered haphazardly, like in most mountain settlements. They were arranged in a very deliberate circle around a central clearing. In the middle of that clearing was a large flat stone, almost like an altar, with channels carved into its surface that led to a depression in the center. I'd never seen anything like it in my research. I photographed it extensively, my mind already racing with theories about communal gathering spaces, or possibly some kind of religious practice. As the light faded, I noticed something else. Bones. Animal bones, mostly deer and smaller creatures, scattered around the edges of the clearing, especially near the central stone. Some were old and weathered, but others looked more recent. I assumed it was from predators, using the clearing as a feeding spot, though it seemed like an unusual concentration. I returned to my camp as darkness fell, heated up a freeze-dried meal on my camp stove, and settled in for the night. The forest was incredibly quiet. No owls, no rustling of small animals, not even the wind in the trees. Just a thick, pressing silence that made me more aware of every sound I made. Around 10 o'clock, I heard singing. It was faint, distant, coming from the direction of the settlement. My first thought was that other people were out here, maybe local teenagers using the ruins as a hangout spot. But as I listened, I realized the voices sounded wrong. Too many of them, maybe a dozen or more, all blending in a harmony that reminded me of old shape note singing, but with a melody I'd never heard. The words were in English. They might have been some dialect, or possibly not words at all, just vocal sounds. I grabbed my flashlight and recorder and headed toward the sound, thinking this could be incredible for my research if locals were performing some kind of traditional ritual. I moved through the dark forest as quietly as I could, using my flashlight sparingly. As I got closer to the settlement, the singing grew louder, and I could see lights through the trees. Not electric lights, but the flickering of flames, like a bonfire. I crept to the edge of the circular clearing and crouched behind a laurel thicket, my heart pounding with excitement and a growing unease. The central clearing was lit by torches placed around the perimeter, and the flat stone was the focus of activity. There were people there, figures in dark clothing, standing in a circle around the stone. They were the ones singing, their bodies swaying slightly with the rhythm. But something was very wrong. I couldn't make out faces in the firelight, but the proportions were off. Some of the figures seemed too tall or too thin, their movements slightly unnatural, like marionettes being operated by someone still learning how. And their shadows didn't match their bodies. The shadows twisted and writhed independently on the ground, stretching toward the central stone. The singing reached a crescendo, and one of the figures stepped forward, placing something on the stone. From my vantage point, I couldn't see what it was, but I heard a sound, a wet, tearing sound, and then liquid running down the channels on the stone's surface, pooling in the central depression. I must have made a noise, or maybe the recorder in my hand beeped when it reached the end of its memory. Whatever the reason, the singing stopped instantly. Every figure in that clearing turned toward where I was hiding, their heads moving in perfect unison. I still couldn't see their faces, just darkness where their features should have been, but I knew they were looking directly at me. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then, one of them raised an arm and pointed at me, and the others began walking in my direction, not hurrying, just moving with steady, purposeful steps. I ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, no longer caring about noise, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted back toward my camp. Behind me, I could hear them coming, moving through the forest with impossible ease. No sound of branches breaking or leaves rustling, just a sense of movement, of pursuit. I reached my camp grabbed my pack without bothering to disassemble the tent, and ran toward where I'd left the car. The 2-hour hike became a nightmare of stumbling, falling, getting back up, my lungs burning and my legs screaming. My flashlight died halfway, and I had to navigate by moonlight filtering through the canopy, just enough to keep me from running headlong into a tree. I don't know how long it took me to reach the car. It felt like hours, but it might have been 40 minutes. I kept expecting hands to grab me from behind, for those figures to materialize out of the darkness. But I reached the RAV4 without being caught. I threw my pack in the back, started the engine, and reversed down that rutted track at a reckless speed, branches scraping the sides of the vehicle until I could turn around. Only when I was back on the paved Forest Service road did I allow myself to breathe, to think I might be safe. I drove straight through the night, not stopping in Varney, not stopping for gas, until I was on the interstate heading north, at a brightly lit station outside of Roanoke around 4 a.m. While I was filling the tank, I noticed something in the back of the car, my recorder, which I was sure I'd been holding when I ran. I must have dropped it at my camp, but here it was, sitting on top of my pack, placed carefully, deliberately. Someone or something had returned it to my car. The screen showed a new recording, time-stamped from just 20 minutes ago. My hands shaking, I played it back. It was that singing again, but clearer now, and I could make out the rhythm, the cadence. And underneath it, a voice speaking in English. You cannot record what was never meant to be remembered. Go home, scholar. Redbone remembers itself. I deleted the file immediately and threw the recorder out the window into a trash can. Back in Chapel Hill, I changed my thesis topic. I wrote about quilting patterns instead. Nice and safe. Something I could research entirely from library archives. I never reported what I saw to my advisor or anyone else in the department. Who would believe me? And more importantly, I'd been warned to stay away, and I'd ignored that warning. What happened was on me. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. I went online and looked up recent news from that area. Every few years, someone goes missing in the mountains near Varney. Hikers, hunters, even locals who should have known better. The searches always come up empty. No bodies, no evidence, just people who walked into those mountains and never walked out. And I can't help but think about that stone with its channels, about what might be fed to it when the seasons turn and the old agreements need to be maintained. I think about those figures, whatever they were, still performing their rituals in a settlement that's been abandoned for 90 years, still singing their songs, still waiting for the curious and the foolish to stumble into that circular clearing after dark. I never went back to Appalachia for field research. I accepted a teaching position in Arizona after I finished my degree, as far from those mountains as I could get. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm having trouble sleeping, I'll hear it again, that singing, faint and far away, like it's coming from another room or through a crack in the world. And I know that Redbone is still there, still hidden up in those hills, and that whatever keeps it going doesn't need electricity or running water or any of the things a living community needs. It just needs to be left alone. And it needs what it needs. If you're a researcher or a curious explorer, thinking about investigating abandoned settlements in southwestern Virginia, take my advice. Pick a different one. Let Redbone keep its secrets.
Our next account takes us deeper into the mountains, to a coal town where something beneath the ground isn't coal at all. And the company that ran the mine knew more than they ever put in their reports.
This happened to me 7 years ago, in 2018. My name's Daniel, I'm 41 now, and I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I used to work for an environmental remediation company that specialized in cleaning up old industrial sites, particularly abandoned coal mines. A lot of these mines had been poorly sealed when they closed, leading to acid mine drainage, subsidence issues, contaminated groundwater, you name it. My job was to go in, assess the damage, and develop plans for stabilizing and remediating the site. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well, and I felt like I was doing something useful. In May of 2018, I got assigned to a project in West Virginia, a town called Kettle Creek in the southern part of the state. The mine there, the Black Hollow Mine, had been closed since 1983 and had been leaking contaminated water into the local creek system for decades, turning everything downstream orange with iron deposits and killing the fish population. The EPA was finally forcing a cleanup, and our company had won the contract. I drove down with my survey equipment, planning to spend a week doing the initial assessment before bringing in the full remediation team. Kettle Creek was exactly what you'd expect from a dying coal town. A main street with half the buildings boarded up, a population that had dropped from 5,000 to maybe 800, and a pervasive sense of abandonment. The only hotel was a decrepit motel at the edge of town, but the rooms were cheap and clean enough. The first thing I did was check in with the county clerk's office to get access to the old mine records. Maps, production reports, safety violations, anything that would help me understand the extent of the mine's underground workings. The clerk, a woman in her 60s named Eileen, was helpful, but gave me a strange look when I mentioned which mine I was assessing. Black Hollow, she said, more statement than question. They should have left that mine sealed and forgotten. I asked what she meant, and she pulled out a dusty file box from a back room. The mine's been in trouble since the day they sank the first shaft in 1921, she said. More accidents than any mine in the county. Cave-ins, gas explosions, flooding. 57 men died in that mine over 60 years. Company kept reopening it, though, because the coal seam was rich. Then, in '83, they hit something they shouldn't have and sealed it up for good within 2 weeks. Didn't even try to extract the rest of the coal, just abandoned millions of dollars of equipment and closed it down. She showed me the reports, and she was right. The accident rate at Black Hollow was statistically anomalous, way higher than comparable mines in the region. And the closure was abrupt. 1 week, they were running 3 shifts. The next week, the company had filed for bankruptcy and every entrance was sealed with concrete. I asked Eileen if she knew what they'd hit in '83, and she shook her head. Nobody talks about it. Men who worked that last shift don't say a word. A few of them are still alive, still in town, but they won't discuss the mine, act like it never existed. That kind of stonewalling just made me more interested, though my job was environmental remediation, not industrial history. I spent the next 2 days surveying the surface structures and mapping the drainage patterns where contaminated water was seeping out. The main entrance to the mine was a concrete seal in the side of the mountain, cracked and leaking orange water that stained the rocks below. There were 2 ventilation shafts further up the slope, both sealed with grates and concrete but still allowing air exchange, standard practice to prevent methane buildup underground. On the 3rd day, I decided I needed to get into the mine itself to assess the interior conditions. The EPA permit gave me authorization, so I arranged for a cutting crew to come in and open a small access hole in the main seal. The crew, guys from a demolition company in Charleston, arrived the next morning. They cut a rectangular opening about 4 feet by 3 feet, just big enough for a person to crawl through. As soon as the concrete was breached, a blast of air rushed out, surprisingly cold and carrying a smell I couldn't quite identify, like a mix of mold, damp earth, and something else, something organic and unpleasant, almost like rotten meat. The crew supervisor made a face. "That's some nasty air," he said. "You sure you want to go in there?" I had a respirator and gas detector, and I'd been in worse environments. I told them I'd be fine and would be out in a few hours. I put on my gear, hard hat with a headlamp, respirator, hip waders for the water, and a harness with rope in case of unstable ground, and crawled through the opening. Inside, the mine entrance tunnel was about 8 feet wide and 7 feet high, carved through solid rock with timber supports every 10 feet. The floor was covered in several inches of contaminated water, and the walls glistened with moisture and mineral deposits. My headlamp beam didn't penetrate very far into the darkness. The tunnel curved away to the left after about 50 feet. I carried a portable air monitor, and the readings were acceptable. Low oxygen, but not dangerously so. Minimal methane, no hydrogen sulfide. The temperature was about 50 degrees, much colder than the spring air outside. I started walking, documenting everything with a digital camera and taking notes. The tunnel ran fairly straight for several hundred yards, passing intersections with other tunnels branching off. The mine had been extensive, with multiple levels and miles of passages. I stuck to the main haul road, not wanting to get lost on my first exploration. The silence was total, except for my footsteps splashing through water and my breathing inside the respirator. As I went deeper, I started noticing oddities. There were marks on the walls, scratches that didn't look like tool marks or natural formations. They were too regular, too deliberate, almost like tally marks or some kind of notation system. And there were objects left behind that seemed wrong for an abandoned mine. Not just equipment, but personal items. A pair of boots, sitting upright in the middle of the tunnel as if someone had stepped out of them and walked away. A lunch pail hung on a timber support, rusted shut. A coat draped over a rail car, dry and brittle with age. About half a mile in, I reached a large chamber, probably a former equipment staging area or a junction between different mining levels. The ceiling here was at least 20 feet high, supported by massive wooden beams and steel bolts drilled into the rock. My headlamp swept across the space and I stopped. On the far wall, someone had painted something in white paint, letters 6 feet tall. "Keep to the light. Do not answer if it calls you." Below that, in smaller letters, "God will not hear you down here." My skin prickled. This was clearly a message from the miners, probably from that last shift in 1983. I took several photographs, the flash briefly illuminating the entire chamber, and that's when I saw the opening. On the opposite side of the chamber, a section of the rock wall had been excavated, creating a passage that didn't match the rest of the mine's construction. It was rougher, less regular, and it angled sharply downward. This hadn't been part of the original mine plan. This must have been what they'd broken through to in '83, whatever anomaly made them abandon the site. I should have turned back. My job was to assess the environmental damage, not to explore uncharted passages. But I'm a curious person by nature, and I convinced myself that I needed to understand the full extent of the mine's structure. I approached the opening and shone my light down. The passage dropped at about a 45-degree angle, the walls smooth in a way that didn't look like human excavation. The air coming from below was noticeably colder and carried that rotten smell more strongly. My air monitor started showing slightly elevated CO2, but still within safe ranges. I started down, bracing my hands on the walls. The passage was just wide enough for one person, and it twisted as it descended, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. After maybe 100 feet of descent, the passage leveled out and opened into another chamber, this one natural, a cave that the mine had accidentally breached. My headlamp revealed a space perhaps 50 feet across with a ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was uneven rock, dry here, no water seepage, and the walls were covered in markings. They weren't modern graffiti or miners' notations. These were old, carved deep into the stone with considerable effort. Symbols, spirals, figures that might have been human or might have been something else. The style was nothing I recognized. Not Native American, not Celtic, not anything from any culture I'd studied. And in the center of the chamber was a depression in the floor. A pit about 10 feet in diameter, perfectly circular, edges worn smooth. I walked to the edge and pointed my light down. The pit descended vertically, deeper than my light could penetrate. I picked up a rock and dropped it in, listening. It took a long time to hit bottom, and when it did, the sound was wrong. Not a sharp crack of stone on stone, but a dull, wet thud, like something had caught it. Then I heard the sound that Eileen's warning had prepared me for, though I hadn't understood it until that moment. From deep in the pit, something breathed. It was a long, slow exhalation, like a sleeping giant stirring, and with it came a wave of that rotten smell so strong that even through my respirator I gagged. The breathing continued, regular, patient, and I realized with creeping horror that it had been breathing all along, but I hadn't noticed it until I'd called attention to myself by dropping the rock. The air in the chamber felt heavier, thicker, and my headlamp began to flicker. The batteries were fresh. There was no reason for it to malfunction. In the stuttering light, the shadows on the walls seemed to move independently, the carved figures seeming to writhe and gesture. Then it spoke my name. Not out loud. I didn't hear it with my ears. It was in my head, a voice that was simultaneously a whisper and a shout, bypassing my physical senses entirely and resonating in my thoughts. "Daniel," it said, drawing out the syllables like it was savoring them. Daniel came down. Daniel came to look. Does Daniel want to see? I backed away from the pit, my rational mind trying to find an explanation. Gas-induced hallucination, equipment malfunction causing some kind of electromagnetic effect, panic and exhaustion creating auditory illusions. But my instincts, the ancient part of my brain that kept my ancestors alive when they lived in caves, knew better. This was real. Something was down there, something that had been sealed away by the rock until the Black Hollow mine broke through to this chamber in 1983, and it was aware of me. I ran. I scrambled back up that angled passage, slipping on the smooth stone, skinning my hands and knees, but not caring. Behind me, I could hear the breathing, getting louder, faster, excited. And I could hear other sounds now. Scraping, clicking, wet movement like something large pulling itself up from the depths. The voice in my head kept talking, no longer using my name, just speaking in a language I didn't understand. But that filled me with primal terror. I reached the main mine tunnel and sprinted back toward the entrance, my lungs burning, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly. The personal items I'd seen on the way in, the boots, the lunch pail, the coat, were gone. In their place were dark, wet stains on the tunnel floor. I saw light ahead, the opening we'd cut, daylight streaming in like a beacon. I've never been so grateful to see the sun. I threw myself through the opening, landing hard on the rocky ground outside, and the demolition crew grabbed me asking if I was okay. I was gasping, unable to speak, and when I finally got my respirator off and looked back at the mine entrance, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Just inside the opening, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. It was too tall, too thin, standing motionless in the shadows, watching. The crew didn't see it. They were focused on me. But I saw it, and I knew it was deciding whether to follow me out into the light. I told the crew to seal the entrance immediately. They argued. We had a schedule. I hadn't completed my assessment. But I pulled rank, told them the air quality was dangerous, that there were structural issues, anything to get them to reseal it. It took them 2 hours to mix and pour new concrete, filling the opening completely. I stood there the entire time, watching, and I swear I could feel that thing inside watching back, patient and eternal, knowing that eventually someone else would open the mine again, knowing it could wait. I drove back to Pittsburgh that same evening and submitted a report recommending that Black Hollow Mine be classified as too unstable and too contaminated for remediation, suggesting instead that it be permanently sealed and monitored but not entered. The EPA accepted my recommendation, probably because it was cheaper than a full cleanup. I never told my supervisors or the EPA what I'd really found down there. I quit the company 3 months later and now work in an office, doing environmental compliance paperwork for a manufacturing company. No more field work, no more mines, no more going underground. But I still think about it. I think about how many mines throughout Appalachia have broken through into places they shouldn't have, spaces that were sealed away by geology for thousands or millions of years. I think about what might be down there in the dark and the cold, breathing slowly and waiting. And I think about the warning painted on that chamber wall. Do not answer if it calls you. Because it called me. It used my name, and even though I didn't answer, even though I ran, part of me worries that by going down there, by acknowledging its presence, I've connected to it somehow. Sometimes late at night, when I'm alone and it's very quiet, I hear that voice again, distant but clear. Daniel. Daniel came down. Will Daniel come back? I never will. God help me, I never will. But I can't shake the feeling that it doesn't matter. That by opening that door, I've made it possible for something to eventually open it from the other side. If you work in environmental remediation or mine safety, and you're told to assess a mine that was closed suddenly, that has a history of unusual accidents that locals won't talk about, please think carefully before you go in. Some places are sealed for reasons that have nothing to do with environmental regulations or safety codes. Some things are better left buried in the dark.
The next testimony comes from a woman who accepted a job as a rural mail carrier and quickly learned that some addresses in Appalachia aren't meant to receive regular visits.
My name is Jennifer. I'm 36, and I'm from Richmond, Virginia. Back in 2016, I was going through a rough divorce and needed a fresh start, so I applied for a position as a rural mail carrier with the USPS. I got assigned to a route in eastern Tennessee, covering a huge territory in the mountains, over 100 miles of winding roads, serving about 300 mailboxes spread across 4 hollows and 2 ridges. The pay was okay, and I thought the isolation would be good for me while I processed the end of my marriage. I moved to the town of Crossville in August and started my route in September. Training was minimal. Another carrier showed me the route over 2 days, pointing out which roads were reliable, which turned to mud after rain, where the dogs were dangerous, the usual stuff. There was one section of the route, though, that made him uncomfortable. It was a gravel road that branched off Highway 62, marked with a battered green sign that read, Stillwell Road, no outlet. According to the route map, there were 7 addresses along Stillwell Road, deep in what the locals called the Painter's Creek Valley. My trainer, a guy named Ron, who'd been doing this for 15 years, was clearly reluctant to talk about it. Just deliver the mail and leave, he said. Don't accept any invitations. Don't eat or drink anything they offer you. And if you're running late and the sun's going down, skip it. Come back the next day. I laughed, thinking he was hazing the new person, but his expression was dead serious. The first few times I drove Stillwell Road, it seemed normal enough. The road was rough but passable, winding through dense forest for about 3 miles before reaching the first mailbox. The houses back there were old but maintained, simple frame houses from the 30s and 40s, with gardens and chickens and the usual rural setup. The people I met were polite, mostly older folks. Very quiet. They'd nod if they saw me, maybe wave, but nobody tried to make conversation. I'd put the mail in their boxes and move on to the next one. The whole section took about 45 minutes, and I was usually in and out by early afternoon. but I started noticing things that didn't add up. First, the mail. The addresses on Stillwell Road received almost no normal mail. No bills, no catalogs, no junk mail. What they did get were handwritten letters, packages with no return addresses, and occasional manila envelopes with nothing but numbers written on the outside. I'm not supposed to look at people's mail, but it's hard not to notice when you're handling it all day. Second, the names on the mailboxes: Farrow, Odom, Stillwell, Painter. On a normal route, you'd expect variety, different surnames showing different families. Here, it was just those 4 names, repeating across all 7 addresses. Third, the dates on the letters. Several times, I delivered envelopes that were postmarked from the 1970s and 80s, sometimes even earlier. Old letters that had been in the system for decades, somehow still being delivered. I asked the postmaster about it when I got back to the office one day. He looked at me over his glasses and said, "Stillwell Road is on the route, so we deliver. That's all you need to know." I pressed, asked about the old postmarks, and he cut me off. "Jennifer, some routes have special considerations. You deliver the mail, you don't ask questions, and you don't talk about what you see. That's how it's always been." That should have been a warning to just do my job and keep my head down. But I've never been good at leaving mysteries alone. It was late October when things started getting strange. I was running behind schedule one day because of a problem with the truck. Alternator issues that took an hour to fix in Crossville. And I didn't reach Stillwell Road until almost 4:30 in the afternoon. The sun was already low, shadows stretching long across the road. I thought about Ron's warning about not being there after dark, but I had a certified letter that required a signature for the Odom address, the 4th mailbox, so I couldn't skip it. I drove in, the truck bouncing over the rough road, and delivered to the first 3 addresses without incident. When I reached the Odom house, I pulled into the gravel drive and honked. The usual signal for certified mail. An old woman came out onto the porch. She had to be at least 80, thin and bent, wearing a long dress that looked homemade. She signed for the letter without looking at me, then paused. "You're late today," she said. It wasn't a question. I apologized, explained about the truck trouble. She looked at the sky where the sun was touching the ridge. "You need to finish and get off this road before full dark," she said. "Tonight's not a night for outsiders to be here." I asked what she meant, and she just shook her head. "Finish your route. Go quickly." I got back in the truck, my unease growing. I had 3 more addresses to deliver to. The 5th and 6th went fine, though I noticed lights coming on in the houses as I passed, even though it wasn't quite dark yet. Candles and lanterns, not electric lights. When I reached the 7th and final mailbox, the one at the very end of the road where Stillwell Road terminated at a locked gate with a wooded trail beyond. The sun had set behind the ridge, and twilight was settling in. The mailbox was a large, rural-style box mounted on a post, painted black, with Painter written on it in white letters. I put the 2 envelopes I had for that address into the box and turned to get back in the truck. That's when I noticed the silence. The usual evening sounds, birds, insects, wind, were gone. It was completely, utterly quiet. And there was a smell in the air, like wood smoke and something herbal, sage or tobacco. I looked back toward the houses I'd passed, and I could see fires now, small bonfires in the yards, with people standing around them, not doing anything, just standing, watching in my direction. There had to be 20 or 30 people, way more than should have been, living in those 7 houses, and they were all facing toward where I stood at the end of the road. I got into the truck fast and started the engine. As I did, I heard singing start, coming from those distant figures around the fires. It was the same kind of old mountain singing I'd heard at church services, that shape note harmony, but the song was nothing I recognized. The melody was minor, almost a chant, and it raised the hair on the back of my neck. I put the truck in gear and started driving back out, faster than was safe on that rutted road. As I passed each house, the people standing by the fires turned to track my movement, but nobody moved toward me or tried to stop me. They just sang and watched. I made it back to Highway 62 and didn't slow down until I was 10 miles away, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I got back to the post office, I told the postmaster I wasn't doing Stillwell Road anymore, that he could fire me if he wanted, but I wasn't going back. He didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "I'll have Ron take that section. You can cover his in-town route." I asked him what the hell was going on back there, what those people were doing. He sighed and said, "People in Painters Creek have been there longer than Crossville, longer than Tennessee was even a state. They keep to themselves, they follow their own ways, and they don't bother anyone who doesn't bother them. The government made a deal a long time ago. They'd accept mail service and stay on the census. And in return, we don't ask questions about how they live or what they do. It's worked for 100 years. Just let it be." I should have let it be. But a few weeks later, in early November, I was at the county library on my day off and decided to look into the history of Painters Creek. There wasn't much in the official records. The settlement was listed in census records going back to 1830, always with a population between 50 and 100, always with the same family names. But I found a reference in a book about Appalachian folklore, a chapter on isolated communities with variant religious practices. It mentioned Painters Creek as an example of a settlement that had preserved pre-Christian religious elements, particularly related to ancestor worship and seasonal festivals. The author noted that the community had refused all outside observation, and that researchers who'd attempted to study them had been discouraged from pursuing further inquiry. There was also a newspaper clipping from 1952, a small article about a postal carrier who'd gone missing. He'd been delivering mail on what was then called the Painters Creek route when he failed to return one October evening. His truck was found abandoned at the end of Stillwell Road. The mail still in it, but the carrier was never found. The search was called off after 3 days, and the article mentioned that local residents claim no knowledge of the carrier's whereabouts. No follow-up articles, no resolution. Just gone. I stopped researching after that and focused on my new route, but I couldn't completely avoid Stillwell Road. It was visible from Highway 62, and I passed the turnoff every day. In late November, I noticed something that made me break out in a cold sweat. There was a new mailbox at the junction where Stillwell Road met the highway. It hadn't been there before. It was the same style as the others on that road, black with white letters, but the name on it wasn't Farrow or Odom or Stillwell or Painter. It was Bowden, the name of the postal carrier who disappeared in 1952, according to that article I'd found, and there was mail in it. Someone had been delivering to that mailbox. I called Ron that night and asked him if he'd put that mailbox on his route. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Yeah, it appeared about 3 years ago. I delivered to it. Never seen anyone pick up the mail, but it's empty when I come back the next week, so someone's getting it." I asked him what the mail was. Bills? Letters? What? He said it was always the same. Handwritten letters with no return address and old postmarks, just like the mail for the other addresses on Stillwell Road. Letters sent to a man who'd been dead or missing for over 60 years. I put in for a transfer in January and moved to a route in Eastern Virginia by March. I never drove past that junction on Highway 62 again if I could help it. But I think about it sometimes, about those people standing around fires in the twilight, singing their old songs. I think about what they were doing, what they might have been preparing for or celebrating. And I think about that postal carrier from 1952 and whether he's still there in some sense, still part of that community in Painters Creek, still receiving his mail week after week, like nothing ever happened. If you work for the Postal Service and you get assigned a route in rural Appalachia, pay attention to the warnings from the old-timers. If they tell you not to deliver after dark, don't. If they tell you certain roads have special considerations, believe them. The mail always goes through. That's the motto. But some addresses are receiving more than just letters and packages. Some places are using the postal system to maintain a connection to something outside normal time. outside the normal world, and you don't want to get caught up in whatever they're sustaining with those deliveries. I delivered mail for a living. Now I work in an office, processing forms and never going into the field. And that's exactly how I want it. Some routes aren't worth the pay, no matter how good it is.
Our next story takes us to a boarding house in a struggling mountain town, where the long-term residents have been there much, much longer than their leases would suggest.
This is Rachel speaking, and I'm 43 now. Back in 2013, I was working as a freelance photographer and writer, doing travel pieces for various magazines and websites. Not a lucrative career, but it allowed me to move around and live cheaply while building my portfolio. That winter, I was looking for a place to stay for a few months in Appalachia. I'd gotten a small grant to document dying coal towns, and wanted to be based somewhere central to several communities I planned to visit. I found a listing online for a boarding house in West Virginia, a town called Eldon Creek, offering monthly rentals at an incredibly cheap rate. $75 a week, all utilities included, shared kitchen and bathroom. It seemed too good to be true, but the photos looked decent, and the landlady's email responses were professional. So I sent a deposit and drove down from Philadelphia in December. Eldon Creek was worse than I'd imagined. The coal mine had closed in 2009, and half the town had simply left. The main street was mostly empty buildings, windows broken or boarded, the few remaining businesses, a dollar store, a diner, a post office, clinging on through sheer stubbornness. The boarding house was a 3-story Victorian on a side street, painted a faded yellow with white trim. It had clearly been grand once, probably built in the 1890s when the town was thriving. But now it sagged visibly, the porch listing to one side and several shutters hanging loose. The landlady, Mrs. Caudle, was waiting for me when I arrived. She was probably 70, heavy-set, wearing a housecoat and slippers despite the cold. She showed me to my room on the second floor, a decent-sized space with a bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the street. "Rent's due Fridays," she said. "Quiet hours after 10, no guests overnight, kitchen's open 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Standard boarding house rules. She mentioned there were 4 other residents, all long-term. "They keep to themselves mostly," she said. "You'll see them at meals, but they don't socialize much." That was fine with me. I was there to work, not to make friends. I settled in, unpacking my camera equipment and laptop, and went down to the shared kitchen around 7 that evening to make dinner. That's when I met the other residents. 3 of them were eating at the long table. 2 men and a woman, all elderly, probably in their 70s or 80s. They looked up when I entered but didn't greet me, just watched silently as I introduced myself and made small talk about how I was a photographer staying for a few months. They nodded but said nothing, then went back to their meal. The woman was eating soup with a spoon that shook in her hand. One of the men was staring at a plate of food he wasn't touching. The other man was reading a newspaper, so old the paper was yellowing. I made a simple dinner and sat at the opposite end of the table, trying not to feel uncomfortable. The silence was oppressive. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the scraping of the woman's spoon and the rustle when the old man turned a page of his ancient newspaper. After about 20 minutes, they all stood simultaneously, as if on a signal I hadn't heard, and left the kitchen. I sat there alone, the room suddenly feeling much colder, and noticed something strange. They'd left their dishes, plates with food still on them, cups half full of coffee, just left on the table. I assumed maybe that was house culture, that Mrs. Caudle would clean up. So I washed my own dishes and went back to my room. Over the next few days, I fell into a routine. I'd leave early in the morning to photograph and interview people in surrounding towns, then return in the evening to process photos and write. The other residents maintained their pattern. They'd be in the kitchen at set times, always the same 3, always silent, always leaving their dishes. I learned their names from Mrs. Caudle. The woman was Miss Pruitt. The man with the newspaper was Mr. Calloway. And the quiet one who never ate was Mr. Denning. There was supposed to be a 4th resident, Mrs. Harkness, but I never saw her. When I asked about her, Mrs. Caudle said she was keeping to her room and wasn't well. About 2 weeks in, I started noticing inconsistencies. The newspaper Mr. Calloway read every evening was always the same one, the Eldon Creek Gazette, dated April 14, 1971. Not a reproduction or a special edition, the actual paper, yellowed and brittle. And the food the residents ate never seemed to decrease. Miss Pruitt would have a bowl of soup, eating slowly, but the level of soup in the bowl stayed the same, no matter how many spoonfuls she took. Mr. Denning's plate of beans and cornbread looked identical every evening, down to the arrangement. I thought maybe I was seeing things, that the repetitive nature of boarding house life was playing tricks on my perception, but I started taking mental notes, and the pattern held. Then there was the matter of the cold. The house was always cold, despite the furnace running. My room especially. I'd wake up at night and see my breath, even though I'd gone to sleep warm under 3 blankets. And there were sounds. Footsteps in the hallway at odd hours, slow and deliberate. Passing my door, but never stopping. Doors opening and closing on the 3rd floor, where Mrs. Caudle had told me there were no occupied rooms. And once, around 2 in the morning, I heard singing. A woman's voice, thin and wavering, coming from somewhere above me. I couldn't make out the words, but the melody was sad, almost a lullaby. I tried to dismiss it all as just the quirks of an old house and eccentric residents, but my unease kept growing. In my 3rd week there, I came back late one evening after a long day of shooting in a town 40 miles away. It was nearly midnight, well past quiet hours. The house was dark except for a light in the kitchen. I was hungry and thought I'd just make a quick sandwich, so I went in. The 3 residents were there, sitting at the table in the same positions they always occupied. At midnight, in the dark except for a single candle burning in the center of the table, they were staring at empty plates, not eating, not moving, just sitting. I froze in the doorway. "Sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you," I said. They didn't respond, didn't acknowledge my presence. After a moment, Miss Pruitt slowly turned her head to look at me, and in the candlelight, her eyes were wrong, clouded, milky, not seeing. And her skin had a gray pallor that I hadn't noticed before, like old wax. I backed out of the kitchen and went to my room without eating, my heart hammering. I locked the door and pushed the dresser against it, feeling foolish but unable to shake the terror that had gripped me in that moment. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, the dresser was back in its original position, though I had no memory of moving it. I found Mrs. Caudle in her sitting room and told her I needed to talk about the other residents. She looked at me with an expression that was almost pitying. "They're no trouble, are they?" she asked. "They keep to their routines. They don't bother anyone." I said they were disturbing me, that something wasn't right about them. She sighed. "Rachel, I'm going to be straight with you. You're not the first person who's noticed. Every few years, someone new comes to stay, and they start asking questions. The house needs income, needs someone living here who's part of the current world, or the state will condemn it. So I rent that room on the 2nd floor. But the others, they've been here a long time. They have nowhere else to go." I asked her what she meant, how long they'd been there. She stood up and went to a drawer, pulling out a photo album. She opened it and showed me a picture from the 1970s, the boarding house in better condition, with a group of people on the porch. She pointed to 3 faces, Miss Pruitt, Mr. Calloway, Mr. Denning. They looked exactly the same as they did now, same clothes, same age. "They died here," Mrs. Caudle said quietly. Miss Pruitt in 1971, heart attack in the kitchen. Mr. Calloway in 1968, fell down the stairs. Mr. Denning in 1983 just didn't wake up one morning. They stayed. They didn't have family to take them, didn't have anywhere else they belonged. So they just continued, eating their meals, following their routines, living in the house like they always had. And I let them, because it seemed cruel to force them out when they weren't hurting anyone. I should have left immediately. But she kept talking, showing me more pictures. Other residents from over the decades, Some I recognized from old newspaper clippings in the local library. All people who died in the house or in Eldon Creek and somehow remained attached to this building. Mrs. Harkness is upstairs, Mrs. Caudill continued. She's been here since 1954. She doesn't come down anymore. The house holds them, gives them a place to be, and in return, they help keep it standing. Old houses need people, need life, even if it's life that's already passed. She looked at me directly. You can stay and finish your work. They won't harm you, or you can leave. But if you leave, don't talk about this. People wouldn't understand, and the state would close the house. These folks have nowhere else to go, and I won't have them wandered. I stayed. I don't know why, exactly. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe it was pity for these souls stuck in endless routines. Maybe it was just that I'd paid through the end of February and was too broke to lose that money. I kept to myself, nodded to the residents when I saw them, and tried not to think too hard about what they were. But I did start photographing them, discreetly, telling myself it was documentation. In the photos, they appeared slightly translucent, their edges blurred like double exposures. In person, they seemed solid enough, but the camera saw something different. One night in late February, a few days before I was scheduled to leave, I woke to footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside my door, and then I heard a voice. Rachel. It was Miss Pruitt. Rachel, dear, are you awake? I didn't answer, didn't move. The doorknob turned slowly, but I'd locked it. The door shook gently, like someone was pushing on it. Then the footsteps retreated. In the morning, I found a note slipped under my door, written in shaky cursive. Thank you for seeing us. Most people don't. We're grateful for the acknowledgement. Be well in your travels. It was signed with 3 initials, PCD. I left Eldon Creek the following weekend and never went back. I didn't use any of the photos I'd taken of the residents. They felt too invasive, too personal. I finished my project on dying coal towns, but left the boarding house out of the final piece. Sometimes I wonder if Mrs. Caudill is still there, still renting that one room to outsiders who need cheap housing, still caring for her residents who've been there for decades. And I wonder who else might be there now, which new souls have joined the household, unable to leave the place where they spent their final days. Appalachia is full of old houses, old hotels, old boarding houses where the same rooms get rented year after year. If you stay in one and you meet residents who seem a little off, who don't quite match the modern world, who follow routines that don't make sense, just be respectful. Acknowledge them, but don't pry. They're there because they have nowhere else to go. And the buildings they haunt are the only home they have left. Let them have their routines, their endless meals, their newspapers from decades past. It's all they have.
The next account comes from someone whose job was to map caves throughout Appalachia, and who discovered that some passages don't lead anywhere that exists on the surface.
My name is Thomas. I'm 38 now. I'm originally from Knoxville, Tennessee, and from 2014 to 2017, I worked as a surveyor for a nonprofit organization dedicated to cave mapping and conservation. Appalachia has thousands of caves, limestone karst systems that run throughout the region, many unexplored or only partially mapped. My job was to lead teams into these caves, document their extent, identify any biological or geological features of interest, and create accurate maps for scientific and safety purposes. It was challenging work, physically demanding and sometimes dangerous, but I loved it. There's something about being underground, in spaces humans rarely see, that made me feel like an explorer in an age when everything's supposedly been discovered. In the summer of 2016, I got a report about a cave system in northeastern Tennessee near the Virginia border in a remote area of Hawkins County. A couple of local cavers had found an entrance and explored maybe 300 feet before encountering a passage too narrow for them to continue. They reported unusual formations and a strong airflow, suggesting the cave system was extensive. My team and I decided to make it a priority for mapping. We got permission from the landowner, a farmer who said he'd known about the cave entrance for years, but had always been told by his grandfather to stay away from it. When I asked why, he just shrugged. Grandpa said there were things in those hills that people shouldn't mess with, but that's your business, not mine. Just don't get lost down there. We went in on a Tuesday morning in August, me, 2 other surveyors named Kyle and Amanda, and a biology grad student named Emily who was studying cave-adapted species. The entrance was a small opening in a wooded hillside, partially hidden by undergrowth. We had to widen it slightly with a crowbar to get our equipment through. Inside, the cave opened up quickly into a large passage, maybe 15 feet wide and 10 feet high, with a stream running through it. The formations were beautiful. Flowstone, stalactites, delicate soda straws. We set up our survey stations and started mapping, measuring distances and angles, documenting everything. And the first few hours were routine. We followed the main passage for about half a mile, the cave twisting and branching. We marked each junction, took careful notes. Emily was excited, finding several species of cave crickets and a possible new species of isopod. Around midday, we reached a section where the passage split into 3 branches. We decided to survey the middle branch first. It descended steeply, the ceiling lowering until we were crawling through a tight squeeze about 20 feet long. On the other side, the passage opened into a chamber that immediately struck me as wrong. The chamber was perfectly circular, about 50 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling. The walls were smooth, almost polished, not natural erosion patterns. The floor was flat, covered in a fine, pale dust. And in the center of the chamber was a stone column, not a stalagmite or stalactite, but a carved column, like something from classical architecture, about 8 feet tall and 2 feet in diameter. It was covered in symbols, not writing exactly, but geometric patterns that hurt to look at too long, creating an optical illusion of depth and movement. None of us spoke for a moment. This was clearly human-made, or at least made by something with intelligence, but it shouldn't have been here. The cave system showed no signs of historical human use, no evidence of Native American habitation, no mining activity, and the style of the column didn't match any culture I was familiar with. Kyle approached it and reached out to touch one of the symbols. I told him not to, some instinct warning me, but he brushed his fingers across the stone. Nothing happened immediately, but he pulled his hand back quickly. "It's warm," he said. "Why would it be warm?" The cave temperature was a constant 54 degrees. Nothing should have been warm. Amanda checked her thermometer and confirmed the ambient temperature hadn't changed, but when she pointed her infrared thermometer at the column, it showed a surface temperature of 98 degrees, body temperature. We decided to document it and move on. I took photographs from every angle, made detailed notes, measured the chamber and the column. As I was doing this, I noticed something else. There were no other exits from this chamber except the passage we'd entered through. But the airflow was strong, a breeze blowing from the direction of the column. Air had to be moving through the cave system, which meant there had to be passages we weren't seeing. I walked around the chamber, examining the walls closely, and found it. A gap behind the column, maybe 3 feet wide and 6 feet high, almost invisible because of the angle. We'd have to go past the column to see where it led. Emily said she was feeling lightheaded and wanted to go back to the entrance. Amanda agreed to take her back and said they'd wait for us there. Kyle and I decided to explore the passage behind the column, just a quick reconnaissance. We squeezed past the column, and I felt the warmth radiating from it, almost uncomfortable. The passage on the other side was straight and smooth-walled, descending at a gentle angle. Our headlamp showed it continuing beyond the range of our lights. We walked for about 10 minutes, the passage unchanging, and I started to feel disoriented. My watch showed it was 1:30 p.m., but it felt like we'd been walking for much longer. The air had a strange quality, thick and still despite the breeze, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were going the wrong direction, that we should turn back. Kyle stopped suddenly. "Tom, listen," he said. I stopped and turned off my headlamp, motioning for him to do the same. In the absolute darkness, we listened. There was sound, very faint, voices maybe, or something like voices, a murmuring, rhythmic coming from deeper in the passage, and underneath that, a low vibration, more felt than heard, like a massive engine running somewhere far below. "We need to go back," I said. Kyle agreed immediately. We turned around and started retracing our steps, but within a few minutes I realized something was wrong. The passage looked different. The walls had been smooth, now they were rough, with formations we hadn't seen on the way in. I checked my survey notes. We should have been back at the circular chamber within 10 minutes. We'd been walking for 15 and there was no sign of it. I tried to stay calm, to use my training. We had flagging tape and had marked our route. I looked for the markers, they were gone. We kept walking faster now and the passage started branching. I didn't remember any branches. Kyle was breathing hard, starting to panic. "This isn't the same cave," he said. "Tom, this isn't the same fucking cave." I told him to stay calm, that we just needed to follow the airflow back to the entrance. But the airflow wasn't consistent anymore. It seemed to swirl and change direction, coming from multiple directions at once. We walked for another hour, maybe more, time becoming strange and elastic. My watch said it was 2:15, but that couldn't be right. We should have been completely lost by now, but I kept thinking we were about to recognize something, about to find our way back. The passages we moved through were increasingly wrong. Too smooth, too regular, with angles that didn't feel natural. And the symbols started appearing on the walls. The same geometric patterns we'd seen on the column, but larger, covering entire sections of the cave surface. They seemed to glow faintly in our headlamp beams, phosphorescent. Then we heard the voices again, much closer now. They were coming from ahead, from around a bend in the passage. Kyle grabbed my arm. "Someone else is down here," he said, hope in his voice. "Maybe it's Amanda and Emily. Maybe they came looking for us." But I knew it wasn't them. The voices were wrong. Too many of them speaking in unison, and the words weren't English. They weren't any language I recognized, but we were lost, desperate, and maybe whoever was down here could help us find a way out. We moved toward the voices. We rounded the bend and entered another chamber, this one much larger than the first. The ceiling lost in darkness above our headlamp beams. The chamber was full of people, maybe 30 of them standing in concentric circles around a central point. They were dressed in old clothing, styles from different eras, all mixed together, some in clothes from the 1800s, some from the 1920s, some more recent. They stood motionless, facing inward, and they were all speaking in that unified voice, that chant in an unknown language. None of them acknowledged our presence. We could see the central point of their circle now. It was an opening. In the floor, a pit, maybe 10 feet across, perfectly circular and absolutely black. The darkness in that pit was wrong, darker than mere absence of light, like it was absorbing our headlamp beams. "Let's go," I whispered to Kyle. "Back the way we came now." But as we turned, figures detached from the outer circle and moved to block our path. They weren't threatening, didn't reach for us, just stood there, blocking our exit, and now they looked at us, their faces turning in unison. Their eyes were open but empty, reflecting our headlamps like mirrors. One of them, an older woman in a dress from maybe the 1950s, spoke, her voice still with that chanting resonance. "You walk the old path. You touch the marker. Now you stand at the threshold. Will you descend or will you serve?" I didn't understand the question, but I understood it was a choice, and neither option was good. "We're leaving," I said, trying to sound authoritative. "We're surveyors. We're not part of whatever this is. Let us pass." The figures didn't move. The woman spoke again. "Those who find the path must choose. It has always been so. Descend into the deep places and join what waits, or remain here and help guide others to the threshold. There is no third way. There is no leaving once you've stood in this chamber." Kyle made a decision before I could stop him. He rushed forward, trying to push past the figures blocking our path. They grabbed him, their movement suddenly fast and coordinated, and dragged him back toward the circle. He fought, screaming, but there were too many of them. They pulled him to the edge of the pit, and the chanting grew louder, more insistent. I shouted for them to stop, started toward Kyle to help him, and that's when I felt hands on my shoulders, cold and strong, holding me in place. The woman was right behind me, her breath on my neck. "Watch," she said. "See what waits for those who choose descent." They threw Kyle into the pit. He screamed as he fell, the sound cutting off abruptly after just a second, like he'd fallen much farther than should have been possible in that time. The figure stood at the edge, looking down, and the chanting stopped. In the silence, I heard something rising from the pit, a wet, sliding sound, something massive moving. The darkness in the pit seemed to pulse, to breathe. And then Kyle's voice came from the depths, but it was wrong, distorted, speaking in that same unknown language the others had been chanting. He was answering something down there, having a conversation with whatever existed in that absolute blackness. The woman released me. "He chose descent," she said. "He will serve from below. You may choose differently. Remain here, stand in the circle, and help guide others who find the path. You will not age, will not hunger, will not tire. You will simply be forever in service to the threshold." I looked at the figures around me, at their empty eyes and their clothes from different eras, and I understood. These were people who'd gotten lost in this cave system over decades, maybe over a century, people who'd found this chamber and been given the same choice. Some had descended into the pit, others had stayed, becoming eternal guides and guards. I ran. I didn't think about it, didn't calculate my chances, just bolted for the passage we'd entered from, pushing past the figures who tried to grab me. My headlamp showed multiple passages branching off the chamber, and I picked one at random, sprinting into the darkness. Behind me, I heard them following, their footsteps echoing, but they weren't running. They didn't need to. They knew I was lost, knew I'd eventually come back or find another chamber just like this one. The cave system was a maze designed to funnel people to those pits, those thresholds, to whatever existed below. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and then I crawled. The passage I'd chosen narrowed and twisted, and I squeezed through gaps that tore my clothes and scraped my skin. My headlamp died, the battery drained, and I continued in absolute darkness, feeling my way forward, driven by pure terror and survival instinct. I don't know how long I was underground. hours, maybe a day. Time meant nothing in that blackness. But eventually I felt a change in the air, a freshness, and I crawled toward it. The passage opened up and I saw gray light, daylight, filtered through an opening. I pulled myself toward it and emerged into an overcast afternoon somewhere on a wooded hillside. I was 5 miles from where we'd entered the cave, according to the GPS on my phone. Once I got signal, I was covered in mud and blood, dehydrated, hypothermic. I made it to a road and flagged down a truck, and the driver took me to a hospital in Rogersville. I told the police and the cave rescue team that we'd gotten separated in Wantar, that Kyle had fallen into a pit, and I'd gotten lost trying to find him. They mounted a search operation, sealing off the cave entrance we'd used and bringing in professional rescue cavers. They searched for 3 days and found nothing. No sign of Kyle, no sign of Amanda or Emily either, who'd apparently never made it back to the entrance. No circular chamber, no carved column, no pit. The cave system, according to their surveys, didn't extend more than 800 feet, ending in a silt choke. The passages I described didn't exist. I was investigated naturally. They thought maybe I'd done something to my team, that I was covering up an accident or worse, but there was no evidence, no bodies, no motive. Eventually, they classified it as a tragic caving accident. 3 people lost in an unmapped system, 1 survivor. I was cleared but destroyed professionally. No organization would work with me after that. I moved back to Knoxville and got a job doing land surveys. Nothing underground, nothing involving caves ever again, but I know what happened. I know Kyle is still down there, serving from below, speaking to whatever exists in those pits. I know Amanda and Emily probably found their own chamber, their own choice between descent and eternal service. And I know that cave system is still there, still waiting for the next curious explorers who will find an entrance and follow the passages that lead to the threshold. The carved columns are markers, waypoints in a network that exists beneath Appalachia, maybe beneath the entire continent, places where something old and hungry maintains its connection to the surface world. I still have nightmares where I'm back in that darkness, crawling through endless passages, and I hear Kyle's voice echoing up from the depths, calling my name, telling me I should have made the choice, that it would have been easier to stay. I wake up sweating and checking to make sure I'm in my bed, in my apartment, in the world of light and normalcy, but part of me never left that cave. Part of me is still down there, still running, still trying to find a way out that doesn't lead back to that chamber with its empty-eyed guardians and its pit full of darkness. If you're a caver, if you explore the underground systems throughout Appalachia, be careful. Not all passages lead back to the surface. Some lead down to places that were old before humans walked the earth, places where things wait patiently for the lost and the curious to make a choice they can never unmake.
The next story comes from someone who thought they were documenting folk music traditions and instead recorded something that should have stayed silent.
My name is Claire, I'm 31, and I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. I got my degree in ethnomusicology and spent several years after graduation traveling to different regions, recording traditional music that was disappearing as older generations passed away. In 2019, I received a small grant to document Appalachian ballad singing, particularly the old unaccompanied style that descended from British folk traditions. I'd made contacts with a cultural preservation organization in North Carolina, and they gave me a list of communities and individual singers who might be willing to talk to me and perform. One name on the list caught my attention, a woman named Nell Ferris, living in a remote area of Watauga County near the Tennessee border. The note said she was 96 years old and knew ballads that had been passed down in her family for over 200 years, some of which had never been recorded. I called the number listed and spoke to a younger woman, Nell's granddaughter, who said Nell would be willing to meet with me, but that I'd have to come to her home. Nell didn't travel anymore and didn't like outsiders much, but she approved of anyone trying to preserve the old songs. The granddaughter gave me directions to a house up a long dirt road off Highway 421, warning me that cell service was non-existent up there and to come during daylight. I drove up on a clear October afternoon, the fall colors spectacular in the high country. The dirt road climbed for 3 miles, winding through dense forest, before reaching a clearing with an old farmhouse, weathered gray with a sagging porch and a stone chimney. Chickens scratched in the yard, and a couple of hound dogs announced my arrival. Nell's granddaughter, a woman in her 50s named Barbara, met me and led me inside. The house was dark and cluttered, full of old furniture and photographs covering every wall. Nell sat in a rocking chair near the wood stove, a tiny woman with pure white hair in a bun, her face a network of wrinkles. but her eyes were sharp, watching me as I set up my recording equipment. We talked for a while, me asking about her family history, her childhood, how she'd learned the songs. She was articulate and friendly once she warmed up, telling stories about her mother and grandmother, about singing at community gatherings and churches, about how the songs were part of life, not performance. Singing was how we remembered, she said. Stories, warnings, history, everything important got put into a song so it wouldn't be forgotten. I asked if she'd sing for me, and she agreed. Over the next hour, she sang a dozen ballads, her voice thin and wavering with age, but still carrying the melodies beautifully. I recognized several: Barbara Allen, Lord Randall, The Demon Lover. Each one was performed with slight variations from the standard versions, personal touches that had been added or preserved through generations. Then she paused and looked at me carefully.
"There's one more," she said. "One I've never sung for anyone outside the family. My grandmother taught it to me when I was a girl, and she made me promise to only sing it for someone who needed to hear it, someone who was looking for the truth. I think maybe that's you." I was honored and curious. This was exactly the kind of rare material I was hoping to find. I made sure my equipment was recording and nodded for her to continue. She sang a ballad I'd never heard before. The melody was minor, haunting, with an unusual structure that didn't follow typical ballad patterns. The lyrics told the story of a traveler who came to a mountain community and stayed too long, eventually discovering that the people there weren't what they seemed, that they were keeping something hidden in the hills, something they fed and worshipped. The traveler tried to leave but found all the roads led back to the town, that he was trapped. The final verse described his realization that he'd become part of what was being fed, that his voice would join the chorus that called to other travelers, luring them in. It ended not with resolution, but with a warning. If you hear the singing on the mountain, if the melody calls your name, turn back, turn away. For once you join the song, you'll sing forever in the darkness and the pain. When she finished, the room felt colder. Barbara, who'd been listening from the kitchen doorway, looked pale. "Mama Nell, that's the one you said we should never sing," she said quietly. Nell nodded. "It is. But this girl needs to have it, needs to know what it means. There are places in these mountains where the songs are more than just songs, where they're living things that trap people." My grandmother told me this ballad came from a real place, a settlement up in the high country where people went missing in the 1800s. The song's a warning and a trap, both at once. By singing it, I've put it in your recording, and now you carry it. Be careful who you play it for. Be careful where you sing it. Songs have power, especially the old ones. I thanked her, feeling unsettled but trying to rationalize it as just superstition, colorful folklore. I packed up my equipment, gave Barbara a copy of the consent forms, and left. Driving back down the mountain, I couldn't get the melody out of my head. It was catchy in a disturbing way, the kind of tune that loops endlessly once you've heard it. That night, back at my hotel in Boone, I transferred the recordings to my laptop and listened to them with headphones, taking notes. The ballads Nell had sung were beautiful, exactly what I'd hoped for. But when I got to the final song, the one she'd called a warning, something was wrong with the recording. There was Nell's voice, clear and steady, but underneath it, almost inaudible, were other voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, singing in harmony with her. I turned up the volume and isolated the audio frequencies. The other voices were definitely there, singing the same melody, the same words, but they were off-key, discordant, like they were singing from memory, but had forgotten the exact tune. And they were singing in different languages. Not just English, but German, French, Native American languages I couldn't identify, even languages that didn't sound human at all, with phonemes and rhythms that hurt to hear. I checked my equipment. There was no technical reason for this. My microphone was directional, high quality, designed to capture only what was directly in front of it. There had been no one else in the room except Nell, Barbara, and me. I listened again, and this time I heard something else.
Between verses, in the brief silences, there was a sound like wind through trees, but also like breathing, like something massive, inhaling and exhaling. And at the very end of the recording, after Nell had finished singing, there was a whisper, a single voice speaking directly into the microphone. "We're waiting." I didn't sleep that night. I kept the recording open on my laptop, analyzing it, trying to find a rational explanation. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was some kind of audio artifact, maybe interference from radio signals or electrical equipment. I decided to set it aside and focus on the other recordings. Over the next few weeks, I traveled to other communities, recorded more singers, gathered a substantial collection of material. But I kept thinking about that last ballad, kept hearing the melody in my head. And I noticed something disturbing. Other people started humming it. Not the full song, just fragments of the melody. People I passed on the street, workers at coffee shops, even a professor at the university where I'd gone to work on transcriptions. When I asked them about it, they looked confused, said they didn't know what I was talking about, but then a few minutes later, they'd be humming it again. In November, I gave a presentation at a conference on Appalachian music, playing excerpts from my recordings. I included a snippet of Nell's Warning Ballad, about 30 seconds, just to illustrate the unusual modal structure. After the presentation, several attendees approached me, asking for the full recording. They said they couldn't get the melody out of their heads, that they needed to hear it all. Their intensity was unsettling. One woman, a music professor from Virginia, grabbed my arm and said, "You have to play the whole thing? I need to know where it comes from. I need to go there." I pulled away and told her I'd think about it, but her desperation frightened me. That night, back in my hotel room, I got a call on the hotel phone. No one should have known my room number. I answered and I heard singing, the ballad, all of it, sung by multiple voices in that same discordant harmony I'd heard in the recording. And underneath, that breathing, that wind, that wasn't wind. I hung up immediately. The phone rang again. I didn't answer, but I could hear the singing through the handset, faint but audible, even though I wasn't holding it to my ear. I checked out of the hotel that night and drove straight back to Boston, an 18-hour drive that I did without stopping except for gas. I deleted the recording from my laptop, from my backup drive, from every device I had. But it didn't matter. The melody was out there now, in the heads of everyone who'd heard it. And I'd started having dreams where I was walking up a mountain road, following the sound of singing, unable to stop myself, knowing that at the end of the road was a community of people who'd been singing for centuries, who'd been trapped by the song and now served it, luring others to join them. I stopped working in ethnomusicology. I couldn't risk spreading any more of those old songs, couldn't risk finding another one like Nell's Warning Ballad. I got a job doing data entry, something completely unconnected to music or folklore, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. That melody, those discordant voices, that breathing underneath. And I know that somewhere in the mountains of western North Carolina, there's a place where people gather and sing that song, where they've been singing it for longer than anyone remembers, where they'll sing it forever, waiting for the next traveler who hears the melody and can't resist following it to its source. If you're a researcher, if you're documenting folk traditions in Appalachia or anywhere else, be careful what you record. Not every song wants to be preserved. Some songs want to spread, want to be sung, want to trap listeners and add their voices to the eternal chorus. And once you've recorded one, once you've put it out into the world, you can't take it back. The song is alive now, and it will sing itself through anyone who hears it, whether they want to or not.
Our final story tonight takes us to a volunteer search and rescue operation in the mountains where the missing person they were looking for was found in a way that defied every natural law and left the team questioning what they'd really discovered.
This happened to me just 2 years ago in 2023. My name is Brian. I'm 45 now, and I'm from Asheville, North Carolina. I've been involved in mountain search and rescue for over 15 years, volunteering with a team that covers the areas around the Blue Ridge Parkway and the national forests in western North Carolina. We get called out maybe a dozen times a year, usually for lost hikers, injured climbers, or the occasional person with dementia who's wandered away from a care facility. It's hard work, often in terrible conditions, but it's important. We save lives. In early March 2023, we got a call about a missing hiker, a 28-year-old man named Jonah Peters from Atlanta who'd gone for a day hike on a trail near Mount Mitchell and hadn't returned. His car was still at the trailhead, and his girlfriend had reported him missing when he didn't answer his phone for 24 hours. The weather had been clear but cold, temperatures in the 30s, and the trail he'd planned to hike was well marked and moderate difficulty. It shouldn't have been a difficult rescue, assuming he was just lost or had taken a wrong turn. Our team assembled at the trailhead the next morning, 8 of us, plus a park ranger and a K-9 unit. We divided the area into search grids and started working outward from the last known point, which was the summit of the trail where there was a small observation platform. The K-9 picked up a scent and led us off trail, heading east into denser forest. We followed, marking our route with flagging tape, calling Jonah's name. After about 2 hours, we found his jacket, torn and dirty, hung on a branch like someone had deliberately placed it there. The K-9 got more excited, pulling toward a steep ravine thick with rhododendron. We descended carefully into the ravine, and that's where things started feeling wrong. The forest here was old growth, massive hemlocks and oaks that blocked most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight. The understory was dense and it was very quiet. No birds, no squirrels, not even wind. The K-9 was acting strangely, whining and pulling on the leash, but also hesitating, like it wanted to go forward, but was afraid. We pushed through the rhododendron and entered a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, where the canopy opened up slightly. In the center of the clearing was Jonah. He was standing upright, perfectly still, facing away from us. He was wearing the same clothes described in the missing person report: jeans, hiking boots, a flannel shirt. His arms were at his sides and he wasn't moving at all, not even swaying. We called his name, no response. The team leader, a guy named Marcus, approached slowly, calling out that we were search and rescue, that we were there to help. Still no response. Marcus reached Jonah and put a hand on his shoulder to turn him around, and that's when Jonah fell. He didn't collapse or stumble. He fell straight backward, rigid, like a mannequin, tipping over. Marcus caught him, and we all rushed forward to help. Jonah's eyes were open, staring straight up, unblinking. His skin was ice cold despite the layers of clothing. Marcus checked for a pulse. There was one, slow but steady. Jonah was alive, but he wasn't conscious, wasn't responsive to any stimuli. We called for emergency medical extraction, and while we waited, we tried to warm him up, covering him with emergency blankets and trying to elevate his body temperature. But here's what was disturbing. Jonah's clothes weren't wet, weren't dirty beyond the initial wear. He didn't look like someone who'd been lost in the woods for over 36 hours. He looked like he'd just been standing in that clearing, perfectly preserved, waiting. The medical helicopter arrived and airlifted Jonah to Mission Hospital in Asheville. We were told he was in a coma, hypothermic, but stable. The doctors couldn't explain his condition. His core temperature was too low for someone who'd been wearing adequate clothing, and there were no signs of trauma, no drugs or alcohol in his system. He was just absent, like his consciousness had gone somewhere and left his body behind. The team debriefed back at the ranger station and everyone was confused. Where had Jonah been for the 36 hours? Between when he was reported missing and when we found him. The clearing where we discovered him was only about a mile from the trail, an easy walk. Why hadn't he responded to our calls earlier? Why had he been standing? I couldn't let it go. The next day, my day off, I drove back to that trailhead and hiked in alone to the clearing. I'm not supposed to do that. We always work in teams, but I needed to see the place again, needed to understand. I reached the clearing in the late afternoon, the light already fading. It looked different without the team there, more isolated, more wrong. I walked to the spot where Jonah had been standing and looked around. The ground was undisturbed except for our footprints from the rescue. But I noticed something we'd missed in our focus on Jonah. There were marks on the trees surrounding the clearing, carved symbols about 6 feet up on the trunks. They were crude, made with a knife or sharp rock, and they formed a complete circle around the clearing, one symbol on each tree. I counted 17 trees, 17 symbols, all different but sharing a similar aesthetic, angular, geometric, deliberately placed. I took photographs of each symbol, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The clearing was silent except for my breathing and footsteps, that same unnatural quiet we'd noticed during the rescue. I stood in the center where Jonah had been and looked up. The canopy opening was almost perfectly circular, letting in a column of light, and through that opening, I could see the sky was starting to darken. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps, coming from the forest around the clearing, not just from one direction, but from all directions, a circle of footsteps converging on my position. I called out, asking who was there, but received no answer. The footsteps continued getting closer, and I could see movement in the rhododendron, shapes pushing through the dense undergrowth. I counted at least 7 or 8 figures moving in a coordinated circle. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stood my ground, telling myself these were probably just hikers or locals, that I was overreacting. The figures emerged from the undergrowth and entered the clearing, and I realized with horror that they were all standing in the exact same position Jonah had been in, arms at sides, facing the center, perfectly still. They were different ages, different builds, wearing different clothes, but they all had that same blank staring expression, and they were all looking at me. One of them spoke, a woman in her 40s wearing hiking gear that looked years out of date. "You came back. They always come back. You're curious. You want to understand." Her voice was flat, emotionless. I asked who they were, what they wanted. She continued as if I hadn't spoken. "This place is a crossing. The old ones marked it long ago, and those who stand here cross over. Part of them goes below, part of them stays. We're the ones who stayed. We're waiting for the rest of ourselves to return, but it never does. We just wait. And when someone new comes, we gather, we witness. Maybe one of them will bring back what we've lost." I started backing toward the edge of the clearing, toward where I'd entered. The figures didn't move to stop me, but they all turned their heads in unison to track my movement, their eyes never blinking. "Jonah Peters crossed over 2 days ago," the woman said. "Part of him went below. Part of him stayed, standing here. You took the part that stayed. The part that went below is still there, still walking in the deep places. He'll never be whole. None of us are whole. We're all divided, standing here, walking there, never complete again." I ran. I crashed through the rhododendron and scrambled up the ravine, not looking back, not stopping, until I reached the main trail. I ran all the way to the trailhead, got in my car and drove straight to the hospital to see Jonah. He was still in a coma, unchanged. I told the doctors what I'd seen, and they looked at me like I was suffering from exhaustion or stress. I probably was, but I knew what I'd witnessed was real. I reported it to the team and the Park Service, suggested they close that area, investigate the clearing. They sent a team to examine it, no symbols on the trees, no evidence of anyone being there except our rescue team. They told me I was mistaken, that stress and fatigue can cause hallucinations. Jonah woke up 3 weeks later. He had no memory of what had happened after he reached the summit of his hike. He remembered descending, taking what he thought was the trail, and then nothing until he woke in the hospital. But he was different. His girlfriend said he was detached, like he was only partially present. He'd stare into space for hours, not responding to her voice. He quit his job in Atlanta and moved into a cabin in the mountains alone, and when she asked him why, he said he needed to be close. That part of him was still there, and he could hear it calling, that he needed to go back and find it. I quit search and rescue after that. I couldn't risk going into those mountains. Couldn't risk finding another crossing point, another place where the boundary between here and whatever's below is thin enough to step through. I think about those people standing in that clearing, waiting for the parts of themselves that crossed over to return, and I think about how many other clearings there might be throughout Appalachia, how many other marked places where people vanish or are found changed, divided, incomplete. If you hike in the mountains and you find a clearing that feels wrong, that's too quiet, too still, where the trees around the perimeter have strange marks carved into them, don't stop. Don't stand in the center. Don't wait to see what happens. Some places are crossings, and what you cross into doesn't let you come back whole. Jonah is still out there somewhere, living half a life, waiting for the rest of himself to return from the deep places beneath the mountains. And those others, the ones who stood in that circle, are still there too, eternal witnesses to the crossing, forever divided between what stayed and what went below.
That brings us to the end of these accounts from the hidden corners and forgotten hollows of Appalachia. 8 testimonies from 8 people whose lives were changed by what they found in these ancient mountains, in towns that time has passed by, in places where the old ways never really died. What these stories tell us, if we're willing to listen, is that Appalachia has kept its secrets for good reason. The isolation isn't just geography, it's protection, both for those who live here and for those who might wander in unprepared. The warnings aren't superstition, they're wisdom, earned through generations of living alongside something that was here long before the first settlers arrived, something that will be here long after the towns have crumbled and the forests have reclaimed the roads. If you're planning to visit these mountains, to explore the back roads in the small towns, to hike the trails or document the culture, remember that curiosity has a price. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed. Some paths, once walked, lead you in directions you never intended to go. The people who live here know this. They've learned to coexist with the strangeness, to follow the unspoken rules, to respect the boundaries between the world we know and the older world that persists in the shadows. When they warn you not to go somewhere, not to do something, listen. They're not trying to keep secrets from you. They're trying to keep you safe. Thank you for listening to Blacktop Files. If you have your own experiences from the backroads and forgotten places of America, we want to hear them. But remember, once you speak these things aloud, once you share what you've witnessed, you're inviting others to look for it too. And some things are better left unfound. Until next time, drive safe, stay on the main roads, and don't stop for anyone standing by the roadside after dark. You never know what might get in the car with you.